Now, turning to our program today, The Forgotten Legacies of Broadway, I'm really thrilled and excited to bring this panel to you, and also to bring you Ben West, who you may know or may not know, but you're going to know him after tonight. He is a musical theater artist and historian. His book, The American Musical, is, I think, available for pre-publication now. But The American Musical, so it's going to be a chronicle, a detailed, comprehensive history of the art form's artistic evolution. I'm going to post some things shortly in the chat, so if you want to check out that book, it will be sort of all the information on how to do that. He is the creator of the 20 timeline walls for the Museum of Broadway that trace the history of the Broadway stage from 1732 to 2021 and highlight more than 500 productions and 100 artists. He has worked in various capacities on Broadway, off-Broadway, and regionally. He created the unsung Carolyn Lee, is that how I'm saying that correctly? Correct me if I'm wrong, for Lincoln Center's American Songbook series. And he has lectured and spoken at several institutions, including Yale University, University of Michigan, the Schubert Organization, and now DGCM. He is a recipient of the Lincoln Center's Martin E. Siegel Award. And I'm going to be posting some information on his website and stuff in the chat as well. But with that, I'm going to turn off my video and put you in the hands of Mr. Ben West.
Good evening, everyone. I am Ben West, and thank you so much to Deborah for having me. I'm excited to talk about these artists this evening. Let me just do a little bit of housekeeping off the top, and then we'll dive right in. Item number one is that this won't be set up like a strict lecture. So if you do have questions as we go along, please either raise your hand and Deborah will unmute you, or type the question in the chat and Deborah will read the question as we're going along. So either way will work, and please feel free to ask questions or chime in as we're going along. The other thing I'll mention is we're going to listen to a couple song samples this evening. It won't be the entire song, just a portion of the song, and I will be certain to share sound when I share my screen. So all of the sound should be fine. If anything is a little soft, please try to pump up the volume on your end. I will, again, be sure to share sound when I share my screen. With that, I'll give just a little rundown on the agenda, as we will be talking about lesser known artists who created the American musical, specifically on Broadway. We will generally go chronologically. I will start with an evolutionary chart or timeline, as it were, and then we'll hit on 4 individuals in particular and some of their colleagues and collaborators, and then we'll end with a discussion of review, essentially, and several of the contributors to review, essentially pre-1960. So that's how we'll be set up for this evening. And with that, let me just make sure I haven't forgotten anything. No, I've hit everything. So before we jump into the slides and the timeline, as I share my screen, I will just mention that the heading of this particular affair is Forgotten Legacies, and forgotten is not a very is an open term, shall we say. So there are several very prominent individuals who many people have forgotten, and there are several lesser known individuals who virtually everyone has forgotten. So we will touch on a variety of individuals that fit both of those bills. So some are quite prominent and were hugely successful in their day. Others were perhaps more moderately successful or lesser known in terms of their output. So we'll run the gamut, as it were. So I've shared sound and I'm now sharing my screen, and I will pop up this. So hopefully everyone can now see this image, and the 2 gentlemen, I'm not sure if you're familiar with their pictures. I suspect you're familiar with their names, or certainly their songs. We have, from left to right, Jimmy Van Heusen and Johnny Burke. Johnny Burke is a lyricist. I will just say one of my favorite lyricists in terms of his pop canon, non-stage work. And Jimmy Van Heusen was his frequent collaborator for a number of years. They were tied together. And they had two legitimate stage musicals that they wrote. Both of them were terribly unsuccessful, shall we say. Nellie Bly was one of those. That was in the 1940s. And then Carnival in Flanders, which is 1953. However, from Carnival in Flanders, there derives a major pop standard called Here's That Rainy Day, with which I'm sure you're familiar. So in any case, they are just sort of setting up our evening. We won't take a deep dive into those two individuals, though if you do want to or have questions, please feel free to ask. So as mentioned, I'll start out with this evolution of the American musical to give you an idea of what I'm talking about in terms of the evolution. And then I will go into the individual artists, all of whom I chose based on their relationship to this evolving art form. That's essentially how I picked the individuals that we'll speak of. So they're all pre-60, pre-70 in terms of their activity. As mentioned, evolution of the American musical, I break it down into 7 very distinct eras. I won't go into those in particular right now. But as I just alluded to, the folks that we'll be discussing today are working generally pre-60, definitely pre-70. And again, I chose them specifically with regard to their relationship to this evolving art form. The American musical that we know now is an art form that really matured in the middle of the 20th century. And there is this rush of activity leading up to that middle period. So all the individuals, again, are part of that rush of activity and part of this middle period that establishes the American musical that we understand today. So the first individual that I want to address is Bob Cole. And some of you may be familiar with Bob Cole. I suspect most are not. At least at this point. Bob Cole is someone to whom I refer as the father of the Black musical theater. He was hugely influential in the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century for a number of reasons. He was, first of all, incredibly versatile. He was a songwriter, a librettist, an actor, producer, director, and was very passionate about advancing Black artists and African-American individuals more broadly. And his specifically Black musicals were quite progressive and very contemporary. His first full-length musical comedy was A Trip to Coontown. That is 1897. And you did hear me correctly. The last word of the title is Coontown. And this came about during the ragtime and coon song craze. This was a very specific kind of catalog or genre of song that came about and was very much tied to ragtime at the time, this being the 1890s. Eventually, when we get into the 20th century, throughout that first decade, we start to lose the very derogatory racial stereotypes that are attached to what are known at the time as coon songs. And we have ragtime that is living on its own essentially thereafter, and coming out of it and being refined. And Bob Cole and his 2 writing partners at the time, who are Rosamond Johnson and James Weldon Johnson, you can see all 3 of them in the center, are incredibly influential in this refinement of the sound and of the lyrics of this particular time. So I mentioned Bob Cole's first musical, very successful. In 1900 specifically is when he formed this association with the 2 gentlemen I just mentioned, the Johnson brothers. Just for reference, James Weldon is on top of the trio and Rosamond is in the center. Bob Cole is on the bottom of that middle picture. So again, 1900 is when they officially form their songwriting partnership, and they will become, over that first decade, the most successful Black songwriters of the era. There are several Black songwriters, to be clear, and I'll mention a couple after discussing Bob Cole in a little more detail. So in addition to two Black musicals that this trio, specifically duo, I will say, because James Weldon eventually becomes a dignitary and is and parts ways amicably, of course, with his brother and Bob Cole, and so we're left with Rosamund Johnson and Bob Cole performing these Black musicals. So the two Black shows in particular are called the Shoofly Regiment, which launches in 1906, and the Red Moon, which launches in 1908. And as I mentioned, his shows were very contemporary. They dealt with contemporary themes. They portrayed contemporary Black characters. The Shoofly Regiment, in particular, was set during the Spanish-American War, which is 1898. It dealt with themes of patriotism, with education. The leading character, in fact, or should say, one of the leading characters, who was played by Rosamund Johnson, was in fact a well-educated individual who had just graduated Tuskegee Institute, and he comes back to this Lincolnville Institute is what it's called, in his hometown where he is going to teach, but he ends up enlisting in the army. There are themes of romance that run through this particular show, and there is no blackface to be seen at all. This is something that was constant throughout Bob Cole's work. He did not work in blackface. There was not blackface in his shows. So again, those particular shows were quite influential. And if you're familiar with the name James Reese Europe, who became a very influential band leader, Black gentleman, in the 1910s. He was the music director for these two Cole and Johnson musicals. Prior to their work on the legitimate stage, Cole and Johnson, Rosamund Johnson in particular, went into vaudeville, which was a huge form of entertainment at the time. If there are any questions as to what vaudeville is, drop them in the chat and I can definitely address it. Nonetheless, they were major forces in big time vaudeville. They played the top houses in New York, which at the time would have been Hammerstein's Victoria. They twice headlined the Palace in London. I will add that at this time, the Palace in New York did not exist. It was built or opened in 1913. This is prior to that. So you can see actually an image that represents what would be their vaudeville act in the top right area of the screen, where you have Rosamund at the piano, you have Bob Cole standing next to him. It was a very sophisticated, high-class act. In addition to playing ragtime songs, they played, or I should say Rosamund Johnson, played classical compositions. It was incredibly well received, a very sophisticated, refined, classy act. So again, a very different presentation of African Americans on the stage as to what people had oftentimes been accustomed to. Just a quick other element of what's on the screen. The bottom right is a postcard from London, actually, when they were playing the Palace in London. So I mentioned some other individuals who were working at the time, Black songwriters in particular. This would be Ernest Hogan, for example, Alex Rogers, Will Marion Cook, who was a major force. He was a very highly regarded composer. If you're familiar with the song Swing Along, which was, by the way, used in the George C. Wolfe backstory of Shuffle Along. Swing Along was used in that production, in that show. That is by Will Marion Cook. Burt Williams and George Walker are two major African-American forces during this first decade of the 20th century. So there is a great deal of activity on the Black stage. Williams and Walker are perhaps the most prominent performers on the legitimate stage. But when you get into vaudeville, and especially behind the scenes in terms of moving the art form forward and contributing to the evolving sounds, and pushing forward and progressing really the themes and the content of the Black musical stage, we really start to get into Bob Cole. And that's, of course, why I reference him as the father of the Black musical stage. To make that point, I'll just leave you with one final tidbit of their being Cole and the Johnson brothers' work. They had a myriad of songs, hugely popular. They interpolated several songs into multiple white musicals on Broadway at the time. And when I say multiple, I'm talking more than a dozen. So there are many, many shows on Broadway with interpolations by Cole and Johnson. And in 1904 in particular, there are two white musicals, Humpty Dumpty and In Newport, which have virtually entire scores written by these three Black songwriters, and they are playing on 42nd Street simultaneously. So really, when I say influential, he was genuinely an influential force in the music, in the theater during this particular turn of the century period. With that, I think we'll jump ahead to our next individual, and I will leave you with one of, as we're moving on, with one of the Cole and Johnson songs that was hugely popular at the time. This is called Under the Bamboo Tree. The recording of it is actually slightly more contemporary. It's a mid-century recording by Toni Carroll, who was a Copacabana girl. She also worked at the Latin Quarter. Those are two major nightclubs. And I'll touch on nightclubs actually this evening as we go through. So this is Under the Bamboo Tree, which was one of the major hits of the day in particular by Bob Cole. I said I would go on, but I'm going to add one other nugget, if I may, if you will allow me. Just something interesting about the way that they worked together. They did not all three work on every song. Bob Cole was both a lyricist and a composer. Rosamond Johnson was a composer, primarily, and James Weldon Johnson was a lyricist, primarily. So they would occasionally you would have a song, for example, that is just with lyrics by James Weldon, music by Rosamond. Or you would have a song that is solely by Bob Cole, or you would have a song that is by Cole and Rosamond Johnson. So it was not all three always at the same time. So I just want to point that out. So here we go. Here is Under the Bamboo Tree, which is a major Bob Cole number from turn of the 20th century. This recording, again, mid-20th century.
If you like me like I like you, there's so much that we can do. We can agree, live happily under the bamboo tree. Life is complete and sweeter than sweet.
So talking about this early period, early 1900s, Bob Cole, as mentioned, was hugely successful, as were two women that I'm going to speak about now. One is Rita Johnson Young, the other is Anne Caldwell. Much of their work, as well as the work of their contemporaries, is not lasting, shall we say, is not performed frequently anymore, because they are writing in an incubatory era or an early era in terms of what is happening, both in terms of the popular song and on the musical stage. In both cases, the respective art, which overlaps, is starting to mature. So the Cole and Johnson catalog was hugely popular at the time. It doesn't really hold up as we move forward, and based on the more mature sensibilities that we understand to be possible. We still hear some of his songs from time to time, Under the Bamboo Tree being an example. There's a similar situation, again, with Rita Johnson Young and Anne Caldwell. Just to identify what you're looking at, the left half of the screen is Rita Johnson Young. The right half of the screen is Anne Caldwell. And I will talk about them in that order. Rita Johnson Young, hugely successful librettist and lyricist. Naughty Marietta was one of her shows. This is a comic opera with Victor Herbert. She being Rita Johnson Young, wrote a number of plays as well. I want to focus on one particular musical, or two perhaps, two particular musicals of hers that she wrote. All the way on the left, you can see two images stacked on top of each other, essentially the left column. Both of these images are from a show called Maytime. The top is a backstage picture of Peggy Wood, who was the star. The bottom is actually a setup shot on the stage. The second column is Sometime, as you can tell, of course, by the title, and I'll talk about Sometime in a minute. Maytime is 1917. The music is by Sigmund Romberg. And this is, first of all, a hugely successful show. It's produced by the Schuberts. But it's also an incredibly influential and interesting show in that it is very much, as it was described at the time, a play with music. in which the music was really fused with the action, and in which the characters, contrary to what some think of in terms of characterizing this particular time, in which the characters actually take this downward spiral emotionally, psychologically. There's traces of cynicism, and this spans decades. The story of Maytime effectively is a romance, a tragic romance that spans several decades. So we have 4 acts, essentially, and we see the 2 central figures as they successively age. The last act, in fact, their grandchildren come together. So there is again, it is in this time, it is written in a time, and this is again why we don't necessarily see Maytime performed with regularity today or as part of the permanent repertoire. But the way in which it was written at this particular time, the way it was put together, composed, particularly textually with regard to Rita Johnson Young, is quite fascinating and quite interesting. And the idea of this particular story, again, these elements that I'm talking about, cynicism, regret, this sort of psychological element of a character, it is all surface, again, because of the time in which they are writing. But it is leading toward where we will ultimately go mid-20th century with something like Lady in the Dark, or moving into the Sondheim shows of the late 20th century. So there is this percolation of an idea in the early 20th century that is happening in this particular show. For example, this was 1917, to be clear. The following year, Rita Johnson Young writes Sometime with Rudolph Frimmel, another well-known composer at the time. It stars Ed Wynn, very well-known comic. Mae West is in this particular show, if you're familiar with Mae West. And this, again, has an interesting construct or an interesting idea around it, in that, I don't know if you can see on the screen because the type is quite small, but essentially there is an opening episode, there's a closing episode that's done in pantomime in this ethereal, nondescript place. But the scenes in between essentially alternate between present day real time and scenes in the past, flashbacks that are presented in reverse chronology. So, for example, we have Merrily We Roll Along on Broadway right now. And prior to that, of course, it was a Kaufman and Hart play from the 1930s. But prior to that, we have this element of flashback and reverse chronology or reverse chronological storytelling in what Rita Johnson Young and Rudolph Frimmel are doing in Sometime. This is not as artistically successful as what has happened in Maytime. Nonetheless, it is this adventuring or this interesting way of telling stories on the musical stage. So Rita Johnson Young is working into the 1920s in terms of musicals. Her last musical project is The Dream Girl, which is 1924, which also happens to be Victor Herbert's final musical. So again, hugely influential and successful, I should say, female writer, early 20th century. Likewise, Anne Caldwell. I'll jump over to the other side of the screen. The 2 ladies that are pictured there, you may know, those are the Duncan sisters, who are in a couple Anne Caldwell projects. One is Tip Top, which was a Fred Stone show. There's another one, She's a Good Fellow. And I'll reference those shows in just a moment in relation to some other individuals. The 2 costume sketches that you can see on the right-hand side are from a show called The Stepping Stones, which is also a Fred Stone show. So with that, let me tell you what I mean by Fred Stone show, if you're not already familiar. Fred Stone and his initial partner, David Montgomery, were 2 major stage stars, early 20th century. Starting in 1912, this was not their first show, what I'm about to say, but in 1912 through 1928, there was a series of shows that were built around Fred Stone in particular, and initially David Montgomery, who will die after the second show. So thus the Fred Stone shows. These shows are specifically built around Fred Stone. Anne Caldwell is co-authoring each one of them. Each one of them is staged by R.H. Burnside, a major individual in terms of stage production at this particular period. And each one was produced by Charles Dillingham. All of them were very influential in terms of the style of stagecraft that they employed, and particularly the way that they wove in vaudeville specialties and vaudeville into the action of the show or into what was happening on stage. These were major family-friendly entertainments. Fred Stone in particular would do tons of tricks, high wire walking, for example. In one of the shows, he was clutching the curtain and rode it up to the rafters and rode it back down, tumbling through windows, bicycles, jumping in the orchestra pit. So these were some of his specialties. Outside of that, though, there were specialties by, for example, the Duncan sisters, who you see there on the screen. Other individuals, Belle Story as well. And so this was a very individual style of stagecraft for this particular era, and specifically spoke to Charles Dillingham, the producer, and R.H. Burnside, the director. They would employ this type of technique on other shows as well. Ann Caldwell was an integral part of these Fred Stone shows, which, to be fair, were not particularly well written in terms of the textual content, but they were influential in terms of their overall construct and what was happening and how they were operating at this particular time. There is another series of shows that Ann Caldwell worked on, among others. I want to just focus, though, on this other series with specifically Jerome Kern. These were produced by Charles Dillingham as well, but she and Caldwell wrote these shows with specifically Jerome Kern. This is Jerome Kern just coming off of his Princess musicals. If you're familiar with those are a series of intimate musical comedies, principally at the Princess Theater, and principally written by Guy Bolton and P.G. Wodehouse. So coming off of this very brief series of princess-style shows, Jerome Kern is partnering with Ann Caldwell on a very interesting hybrid style of show that mixes the big spectacle that you get from the Fred Stone shows with this more intimate style show that Jerome Kern had been working on at the Princess Theater and outside the Princess Theater. So a very interesting series from 1919 through 1922. Again, shows like She's a Good Fellow, which I referenced with regard to the Duncan sisters. So let me leave you with one Ann Caldwell song, which does continue to be performed. She was not the most dynamic of lyricists, but had a particular affinity for what I refer to as bittersweet romance or bittersweet regret. And there's a wonderful song from the Stepping Stones, thus the costume sketches over there on the side, called Once in a Blue Moon. The music is by Jerome Kern, lyric by Ann Caldwell, and this is Mabel Mercer performing Once in a Blue Moon. We'll just listen to one time through the chorus.
Once in a blue moon, you will find the right one. Once in a blue moon, find your dear delight one. Then with a thrill, you'll know that love is true. Once in a lifetime, when the moon is blue.
All right, so again, Ann Caldwell is working at the same time as Rita Johnson Young, and the bulk of their work is done pre-20s, some into the 20s, particularly for Ann Caldwell, into the 20s. And we have some of their work that remains and is still viable, specifically some Ann Caldwell numbers, like Once in a Blue Moon. There's another song that she wrote with Vincent Youmans called I Know That You Know, which has gotten a number of pop treatments over the years, over the course of the 20th century. But the bulk of their catalog is of its time, as it were, in this time, which was quite revolutionary and really setting the stage for what will advance and flourish in terms of the art form, crystallize, really be realized mid-century, mid-20th century. So as we get to the late teens and into the 20s, though, this is when we start to have longer lasting, more permanent work. Specifically, if you look at the popular song, which was very theatrical of necessity at the time, there was a a direct overlap between, or near direct overlap between the popular song and the theatrical stage, the musical stage, during the first 3 decades of the 20th century. So by the late teens, we have jazz as a clearly defined term. We start to have a real refinement in popular songwriting, in songwriting more broadly. More of a sophistication. There are different colors added with the infusion of blues in terms of jazz. And so I want to touch on one individual that's part of this songwriting revolution leading into the 20s. And much of his catalog, or I should say many of his songs, are still performed today, incredibly viable, incredibly potent. And this gentleman is Henry Creamer. So you may be familiar with the center song. This is one of his major hits, Way Down Yonder in New Orleans. Dear Old Southland in the top left is another big hit. Whoa Tilly Take Your Time is less of a perennial, shall we say, but equally terrific in terms of its composition. And I'll just mention, if I may, the woman on the right-hand side, who is Ray Samuels. She's just one of many individuals. I happened to select her because she sang at the time a couple of Creamer and Leighton songs. She is a singing comedian, major force in vaudeville, a headliner, alongside folks like Sophie Tucker, Belle Baker. And I included her just to, again, reinforce this connection between Tin Pan Alley, the popular song, and the musical stage. There is a near direct overlap, and the popular song is, during this period, of necessity, theatrical, because it is essentially being sold on the theatrical stage. So Ray Samuels is one of the many individuals who sang Henry Creamer's material. Focusing specifically on Creamer's collaboration with Turner Layton, which is roughly 1917 through 1922. Again, this is really the dawn of jazz. In terms of its proper terminology or getting an official designation. Hugely successful in multiple mediums. I'll go through those mediums. I'll play for you first one of his most popular songs, recorded by a myriad of individuals. I didn't include the sheet music here because I suspect you're familiar with the title. So I'm going to play a Bobby Darin recording of it, and we'll see if you know it on the other side. Here we go. The song is, of course, After You've Gone. Again, has received a number of popular recordings over several years. In fact, someone informed me a couple of years ago that they were familiar with this song because they heard it in a video game. So a long-lasting perennial, a pop standard. And this is written in the late teens. So again, this particular period, roughly 17 through 22, Henry Creamer is working primarily with Turner Layton. They turn out several popular songs which are performed in vaudeville. Henry Creamer, in particular, with Turner Layton, is also a force in 2 specific vaudeville acts. One is called A Creole Cocktail, which was an all-black act, and another all-female act, which was called What Girls Can Do. A quick side note on that. Keep in mind that this particular period that we're talking about right now is essentially the climax, culmination, the height of the women's movement of the day, with culminating essentially with the women's right to vote being ratified in 1920. So thus, one of the elements of that particular act. So hugely successful in his collaboration with Turner Layton. He worked with a myriad of other individuals as well. And I want to just mention two in particular who come after his work with Turner Layton. One is James F. Hanley, who was a major composer in Tin Pan Alley on the legitimate stage. If you're familiar with the Fanny Brice songs Rose of Washington Square, pardon me, and Secondhand Rose, he was the composer of both of those. If you're familiar with also Zing Went the Strings of My Heart, he wrote the words and music for that. That was 1934. Really a very, very good composer, particularly with a particular affinity for rhythm and melody and an interesting combination thereof. He was one of Henry Creamer's better collaborators post the Turner-Layton collaboration. Anyway, the Wind Blows is a very fun song. They wrote a couple interpolations for a show called Honeymoon Lane in 1926. They wrote a number of very characterful, sassy, and melodious songs, roughly mid-20s. Thereafter, Henry Creamer is working with, primarily for a couple years, Jimmy Johnson, who is a Black composer of the period. If you're familiar with the Charleston, which I'm sure you are, Jimmy Johnson wrote a song called Charleston, which was instrumental in popularizing that dance craze. That was his song specifically, was in 1923 for a Black musical called Runnin' Wild. That is with Miller and Lyles, by the way. I'll drop that in there. So the Henry Creamer, Jimmy Johnson catalog, again, very a nicely matched duo in terms of their styles. And they too are working in multiple mediums. Their songs are heard in vaudeville, on the legitimate stage, interpolated into revue specifically. Also, they had a couple songs in a Black musical that starred, again, Miller and Lyles. And they also wrote a nightclub revue. So I said I would talk about nightclubs. And I'll just quickly mention, I won't go into detail unless there is a question or interest about it. At this particular period, turn of the 20th century, throughout the first few decades of the 20th century, Broadway is not strictly the legitimate stage. It is not strictly plays and musicals. It is minstrelsy, vaudeville, burlesque, nightclubs. So nightclubs in particular are a major force on the musical stage and informing what is happening in terms of the American musical that we understand as it matures mid-20th century. So the 20s in particular became quite well known for their Black nightclub revues, Black nightclub revues. And in fact, Henry Creamer and Jimmy Johnson scored a Black nightclub revue on Broadway. It was called The Creole Follies, and it was at a nightclub called Ciro, very similar to the Ciro that you would have found in Europe, the locations in Europe. And there is a major pop standard that was used in that particular nightclub revue. I will play it for you now. It is called If I Could Be With You 1 Hour Tonight. This is a Dinah Washington recording of it. Again, I'll just play a clip and it will fade out to give you a taste of what they were writing.
If I could be with you, I'd love you strong. If I could be with you, I'd love you long. I want you to know I wouldn't go until I told you, honey, why I love you so. If I could be with you.
So I want to just mention two other things about Henry Creamer. One is that he was very influential or instrumental in the resurgence of African-American entertainment that happens in the 1920s. Shuffle Along is a show that I think many people are familiar with. That is 1921, but it did not come out of nowhere. And so some of the engine or the driving factors that are leading up to the emergence of Shuffle Along and a resurgence of Black entertainment involve Henry Creamer. He is very instrumental in that movement. And then, of course, in the dawn of jazz, particularly in his song catalog, which are his songs being performed by both Black and white performers, male and female, etc. The other thing I'll just mention briefly about Henry Creamer, he worked, of course, in Legit, we've talked about, nightclubs, vaudeville, I mentioned, and also burlesque. And when I say burlesque, I'm speaking pre-1930s, before it becomes associated or primarily associated with striptease. So this is a high-class burlesque as represented by the Columbia Amusement Company, generally, sort of condensing that, so just to be clear. And in particular, he wrote the score for a troupe that went out in the 1926 season called Sliding Billy Watson's Big Fun Show. And his collaborator, I will also mention, was a Black female composer named Isadore Meyer. All right, so with that, we're into the 1920s, and I want to jump into, as I mentioned, revue, because this is a major force in terms of the advancement of the legitimate musical stage and book musicals. So I'll begin with, if I may, The Bandwagon, which is 1921, and specifically 1931, I apologize, let me just correct myself. 1931, The Bandwagon, and specifically Howard Dietz. So I mentioned early on that there are different degrees of forgotten, and I'm not sure Howard Dietz is completely or entirely forgotten, but he's often overlooked, I think, today. Perhaps because he is primarily associated with revue, which is a form that essentially died out in the 1950s into the 60s. I'll talk about that in a minute. But Howard Dietz, nonetheless, was a huge force in the emergence of and the refinement of the fostering of sophisticated revue, which essentially crystallizes in the late 1920s and really is flourishing over the 30s and 40s. To give you just a quick review, a quick overview of revue, this is a scripted stage show without a story, without a plot. It consists of songs, dances, comedy sketches, in some cases dramatic elements, a dramatic scene or a dramatic song. But again, it is a scripted evening. So it is a legitimate musical. It is fully scripted. You have the same show every night. There's just not a story, not a plot. It starts to gain definition in America, this particular form, in the 1890s. Ziegfeld Follies essentially inaugurates or launches this extended period of annual revues in 1907. So for the next roughly 2 decades, the revue stage is dominated primarily by annual revues like Ziegfeld Follies, George White's Scandals, etc. There are independent revues, however, along the way. Some small, smart satirical pieces. And by the time we get to the late 20s is when revue really starts to become this defined, sophisticated form, particularly in the hands of Howard Dietz. It is a progression. It's not as quick as I am describing it right now, just to be clear. But I just want to get up to Howard Dietz. So late 20s is when Dietz really comes into his own in terms of crafting revue. The Little Show, in particular, 1929, is a real turning point. Three's a Crowd, 1930. The Bandwagon that you can see right here, 1931. That show, in particular, was conceived by Dietz to be played on double turntables. So I'm sure we're all familiar with Hamilton and the fact that it has its turntables on stage. So jump back X number of years to 1931, and you have The Bandwagon, conceived by Dietz to be played on double turntables. And the material, in many cases, was actually written for the double turntables, or to be staged and performed on the double turntables. His collaborators on that show were George S. Kaufman and Arthur Schwartz. Arthur Schwartz was a frequent Dietz collaborator. I'll mention just a couple of his other revues in this particular period. There's Flying Colors, which is 1932, in which he used both a black and white ensemble. There was also a featured black performer named Monette Moore, whom he discovered at a nightclub, actually. 1935, they being Dietz and Schwartz, do At Home Abroad, which was not actually their project to begin with. They came on to that piece. It was produced by the Schuberts. And then they essentially take a break from revue and we'll come back to the form in 1948 with Inside USA. And that is really that being the late 40s, is really the end of review at its peak. When we get into the 50s, there are still reviews, but this very distinct, very dynamic, very complicated and difficult form essentially starts to die out for a number of reasons. There is television variety, for example. There is the maturation of the book musical, the musical with a story really becomes dominant on the scene at that point. There are a number of reasons. Those are not the only two. But essentially review, a true review, starts to disappear. By the time we get to the late 60s, into the 70s, review becomes this catch-all header, essentially, for retrospectives, for anthologies, etc. All valid forms of entertainment, just not specifically review as review existed and was established on the American stage. So, mini history of review, and that is Howard Dietz who is influential in this emergence of this really sophisticated form of review. So, one of the other elements, or I should say, a couple of the features about review are one, that it was incredibly influential in terms of sharpening material content on the legitimate stage, sharpening storytelling. There was no story in a particular review, but each episode necessitated a sharp story of its own, a punch of its own. You had to begin essentially over each time a scene unfolded. So there was a necessity of sharp writing, satire. It being review was incredibly influential in terms of stagecraft, physical stagecraft, that can be referenced in the double turntable elements that I mentioned. Also in terms of lighting, the way that the review unfolds on a particular stage. And also in terms of the fostering of talent, not only on-stage talent, but authors as well. So here are a few of the, shall we say, lesser-known authors who were working in review in the 30s, I should say late 20s into the 40s. On the left-hand side of the screen, I'll speak about the woman in particular because she's the most well-known of the pair. That was her husband at the time. Kay Swift, who was a George Gershwin protege, a female composer, often misidentified as the first female composer on Broadway or the first woman to compose the score for a musical on Broadway. That's not true. She was certainly among the first. She was not the first, though. That doesn't take anything away from her, to be clear, just as a matter of fact, I want to point that out. So a very popular of the moment composer, did not have a tremendous output on the legitimate stage. She had a song in Howard Dietz' The Little Show. She also scored, and this is the show that is often referenced with regard to Kay Swift, Fine and Dandy, which was a musical comedy, 1930, that starred Joe Cook, an incredible clown comic from the early part of the 20th century, teens, 20s, into the 30s. A major force, Joe Cook was. So Kay Swift. I'll jump to the lady all the way on the right, Nancy Hamilton, a lesser known individual, came out of this series called New Faces. She was actually in the first iteration, which was not a series at that point. This is 1934. She was one of the highlights of that particular show. And then she would end up creating a series of her own with 3 shows of different names that were in succession, essentially. 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to make ready. That's Nancy Hamilton, among other things. She did other things as well, to be clear. Those are her major reviews. And then the gentleman in the middle is Charles Gaynor. And this is actually a picture of him from Dartmouth College in the late 20s, where he attended, which college he attended, I should say. And not really well-known figure at all, but actually quite influential in terms of the individuals who came out of his projects. I also picked him here because he represents the birth or the movement or the emergence of regional theater in America. He, in 1936, began writing reviews for the Civic Theater of Indianapolis. Then he would write reviews for Pittsburgh Playhouse. And all of those shows, the material from all of those shows would essentially be folded into what landed on Broadway in 1948 as Lend an Ear. Lend an Ear was a very successful review, again, 1948. And two individuals, there are a couple individuals that came off of that show with major careers. I mentioned two in particular. One, Carol Channing, with whom you are certainly familiar, and the other is Gower Champion, with whom you are undoubtedly familiar as well. So thus, Charles Gaynor. There are a number of other individuals working in review during this period, both prominent individuals like, for example, Harold Rome, and lesser known individuals like Irvin Graham, who did a number of less prominent, shall we say, reviews. And an interesting tie-in to the program tonight is that Irvin Graham's catalog or copyrights are one of the sets of copyrights or catalogs that is managed by the Dramatists Guild. So an interesting crossover there. So Irvin Graham, June Carroll, several individuals associated with review, both prominent and now lesser known. I want to finish off, if I may, with just one lesser known but prominent at the time individual, so he sort of straddles both worlds, associated with review. And this is Arnold B. Horwitz. Some of the reviews to which he contributed material were Inside USA, which is the Howard Dietz review I mentioned from 1948. He co-authored a couple sketches for Call Me Mr., which is 1946. He also co-authored a couple items for Two's Company, 1952, and his big show for which he provided the majority of the sketches and lyrics was Make Mine Manhattan, which is 1948. So he's working really at the tail end of review, the final gust of review at its peak in the late 40s, and as it sort of drifts off, he is this student of review that finds himself without a form, essentially, and he will, or without a prominent form. He will eventually start writing for television. He wrote many episodes of The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis, McHale's Navy. I want to say he also wrote episodes or an episode for I Dream of Jeannie. Let's check that to be sure. That one I'm less confident on. But big in television, essentially. And one very successful musical comedy in 1955 called Plain and Fancy, which is occasionally referred to as the Amish musical or the Amish musical comedy. And there are a couple songs that come out of that. One major song that became a pop standard. And I will play that for you now. This is not the original cast recording. This is actually a Eddie Fisher pop recording of this particular song. So here's a little clip of a song from Plain and Fancy with music by Albert Haig called Young and Foolish.
Young and foolish, why is it wrong to be young and foolish? We haven't long to be. Soon enough, the carefree days, the sunlit days go by. Soon enough, the bluebird has to fly.
So that's a little bit of Arnold Horwitz, a very good lyricist, a very warm quality to his work, a lightly satirical element to a lot of his work as well. Certainly not that song, but particularly his review work. Another song in that particular show, Plain and Fancy, ribs Oscar Hammerstein, whom he ribbed often in his work. So quite an exciting and interesting figure, and quite a good lyricist as well.
Ben, you've got about 4 minutes left. Sorry to.
Got it. No, that's great. I'm at the end, so that is Arnold Horwitz sort of wraps us up, and that is sort of a taste of many individuals that could easily have been discussed this evening. But I spoke of those individuals in particular. So I think we will leave it there with Young and Foolish and Arnold B. Horwit.